It is hard not to raise an eyebrow when a government policy is described by some as a vital lifeline for students, while others describe the same policy as demoralising and soul-destroying. The GCSE resits policy, which has been in place since 2014, continues to divide opinion among academics, researchers, school and college leaders, and the frontline staff who support those students who must retake English and Maths GCSE after not passing their exams first time around. So what is the thinking behind GCSE resits? Is the current resits policy having a positive or negative impact? And are exam resits the best way to improve the English and math skills of young people beyond the age of 16? My guests are Sarah Waite, the founder and CEO of Get Further, a charity that supports students who are resitting their GCSEs, and Lee Elliot Major OBE, Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter. I'm Tom Richmond, the Director of the EDSK think tank, and to figure out whether GCSE resits are helping or hindering young people, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast from the education and skills think tank EDSK that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including schools, colleges, universities and apprenticeships. You can find out more about EDSK's research at edsk.org or on Twitter at EDSK Think Tank.
Sarah, on the face of it, the idea of GCSE resits for those who don't pass their English and Maths first time around sounds obvious enough, but there's actually quite a lot of detail that sits behind this policy. So talk us through what the GCSE resits policy is and how it works in practice.
So the GCSE resits policy requires young people aged 16 to 18 who have not already achieved grade 4 or higher in both GCSE English and Maths by the age of 16 to continue to study these subjects. The policy is actually officially known as the condition of funding because the requirement is placed on the 16 to 18 education setting as a condition of them receiving funding for these young people. So, for example, if a college didn't ensure that a young person who was missing what we refer to as a standard pass in say, GCSE Maths, was studying Maths as part of their 16 to 19 study programme, then that funding for that student would actually be clawed back from the college. But it's often referred to as the GCSE resits policy, even though there are, as you say, Tom, lots of nuances that sit underneath this. So if a young person has achieved a grade 3 at the age of 16, so one grade off for grade 4, then their post-16 setting would have to enter them for a GCSE qualification as part of their 16 to 19 study programme. If they achieve a lower grade, a grade 1 or 2, then they could actually study towards any approved English or Maths qualification, such as level 1 or 2 functional skills. So the policy was announced back in 2012. It was following the Wolf Review, Vocational Education, which identified that achieving a standard pass in GCSE English and Maths is critical for employment, but that the system was actively deterring young people without these qualifications from gaining these in post-16 education. So that's where it's come from, and it's over a decade old now.
Indeed it is. Okay, so that's the resits policy as it stands. If you get a grade 3, just below a pass, you then have to retake your GCSE. If you get below that, you can choose other qualifications if you want to, but you still have to be working on English and Maths. So just before we dive into the discussion of the benefits and drawbacks of this policy, I think it's worth reminding ourselves why the policy was created. Sarah, you've just mentioned there was a big government review in the early 2010s which flagged some potential concerns. Lee, when we look back at why the coalition government went ahead with this policy, what did you make of their justification? Why did they think we just needed this GCSE resits policy when up to that point, nothing existed in this world? There was no need to resit your GCSEs at all.
So the problem that all governments face is one of the big education challenges, and this has been there for at least 50 years or more, and that is that we have a large number of young people who leave the education system without what we might define as basic, functional literacy, numeracy, math skills. Every government has grappled with this huge problem. It's around 30% of young people don't get a grade 4 in English or maths. I've written lots of reports about what I call the forgotten fifth, which is the young people who don't get both grade 4 in English and Maths, so they don't get either of those qualifications. There's all sorts of debates about whether that grade 4 is really a threshold for functional literacy in Maths. But what is true is that employers, colleges, and everyone uses it as this kind of threshold. So if you do not get it, the damage to your life chances are quite profound. You're less likely to get into employment. There's all sorts of associated issues with health, well-being, future life prospects. Lots of debate about how causal all that is. But basically, it doesn't look good if you don't get that grade 4. It's not good for the nation because it means that there are a lot of young people, many from under-resourced backgrounds who do not fulfill their potential, if you like. And that's not good for national productivity and all those sorts of things as well. So the government at that time did a big review, as Sarah was mentioning, and the resits policy was born, partly because the statistics weren't changing. They still aren't, by the way. We still have very stubborn numbers of young people not getting those grades. So it was launched to address that issue. And 10 years on, we are still, I think, debating some of the detail of that policy.
Okay, so there were a few strands of thinking that sort of fed into this policy around literacy and numeracy skills, around employers and employment, around the needs of society as well. A lot of that obviously sounds very laudable. So let's look at where we have ended up a decade after this policy first came into operation. If we look at the resit pass rates from this summer just gone, 21% of students who retook GCSE English managed to pass their exam by getting a grade 4 or above. For GCSE Maths, the pass rate was 17%. Lee, do these figures say to you that the policy is working, as 1 in 5 students are getting a GCSE pass that they would not otherwise have got? Or do these figures say to you the policy is not working because around 4 in 5 students are not passing their GCSE English and Maths resit?
Well, the statistics are pretty stark, aren't they? And I think one thing you have to put into this discussion is let's assess the statistics by the age of 19, right? So those numbers do go up, right? So you're talking about the first resit, so that I think those statistics are around. So it's a bit like a driving test. Some people compare it with. Many of us, including myself, failed our first driving test and then you go on to retake. So the numbers do look a bit better when you look at those success rates by age 19. But I think by any measure, you'll have to say that this is challenging this policy, right? This is not as successful as we would like. Lots of reasons for that, right? Now, you could look at the quality of teaching. I'm sure Sarah will get into this and the tutoring that young people can receive, but probably not enough are receiving. So there's a whole discussion about the quality of the provision that these young people receive. The other thing I'd say to all this is, when I co-produced the famous EEF toolkit, the sort of what works in education toolkit we did for the EEF all those years ago, we looked at evidence for resits, for retaking years, and it was pretty depressing, actually. There's many countries like America where pupils will retake years. And what we found from the evidence was that if you're just doing the same curriculum, the same stuff, it's pretty demoralising, actually, for your self-esteem and not very successful. So overall evidence for retaking a year or retaking exams isn't very good. It really comes down to the quality of provision that you are then provided.
That's a very interesting perspective. Sarah, as Lee said, you are working with your charity Get Further with students who are resitting their English and Maths. So how do you feel about these pass rates? Do you take a glass half full approach or a glass half empty view if we've got around 1 in 5 students who are getting their pass but the rest aren't?
So I think it's more complicated than it first appears, really. So today, 78% of 19-year-olds have achieved a level 2 qualification in English and Maths. And this is actually the highest proportion ever on record. It's 10 percentage points higher than before the requirement was introduced. So I think Lee's completely right that we need to be measuring this actually by the age of 19 and looking at the full picture of what's happening within post-16 education. And the Association of Colleges estimates that in this academic year or the last academic year alone, 100,000 students actually gained a grade 4 or higher in post-16 education. And we all can also see that a higher proportion of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are now gaining level 2 English and Maths in post-16 education than their peers. So this means that this part of the education system is actually closing the attainment gap that we can see widening in earlier phases. So thinking back to the overall reason why this policy was introduced, we are now in the position where thousands more young people have got gateway English and Maths qualifications by the age of 19 than ever have before. And I think it is important to really commend the further education sector for this, given that they weren't given anywhere near the level of resources and funding that they needed to deliver this policy effectively. And simultaneously, whilst they were introducing this policy, experienced some of the biggest cuts that the education system experienced post-2010. But, as Lee says, saying all that, primarily because of this chronic underfunding, the pass rates are far too low. And I want to be clear, this isn't because the vast majority of these young people are incapable of developing the knowledge and skills to acquire this standard in English and Maths. I think the opposite. I think there's no reason why we couldn't increase the overall proportion of young people holding a level 2 in English and Maths to, say, 85, 90% by the age of 19 over the next 10 years, provided that the sector is funded and resourced and supported to achieve this. And that would have a transformational impact on the number of young people who are able to progress to level 3 qualifications, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. So just to kind of sum up my thoughts on all of this, yes, there are thousands more young people passing and progressing in these qualifications than ever before because of this policy, but could it be also working much better? Definitely.
Well, on the subject of things working better, if you do follow the education news, then I'm sure our listeners will have seen quite a lot of criticism of this policy, the GCSE resits policy, over the past 10 years. Just a few years after the policy was introduced, in fact, we had Ofsted say that, quote, the impact of repeated failure on students should not be underestimated. We've had the Association of School and College Leaders recently say that the current system means that many students are, quote, condemned to a soul-sapping cycle of resits. And we've also had Professor Alan Smithers from the University of Buckingham saying that, quote, it must be soul-destroying to continually have to retake English and or maths. And he added that the resits policy, quote, looks to be utterly demoralising, going back to that word you used, Lee, utterly demoralising to pupils who find difficulty with these GCSEs. Sarah, given what you said you want the system to be trying to deliver, what do you make of these, I think, are quite strongly worded views about the policy? Is it fair to accuse the resits policy of having such a negative impact on students?
To be a bit blunt, not passing the qualifications at the age of 16, at the age of secondary school, can be demoralising. We need to work hard to minimise the number of young people who end up in that position. But simultaneously, we also do need to do better at embedding the concept of second chance education within our compulsory education system. And, emphasising and getting the message across to young people that the age of 16, it doesn't have to be the defining moment in their education. And we don't want young people written off at this age and held back for the rest of their lives based on this one moment. It should be seen as more than okay for them to gain these qualifications in post-16 education. And in fact, by doing so, they're also demonstrating resilience and tenacity after, bouncing back from what's happened at the age of 16, which is an important skill in and of itself. And the other thing I'd add is that, if they don't gain these qualifications and later on in life are consistently coming up against jobs that they can't apply for or are being rejected from because they don't hold these qualifications, then that can be extremely demoralising and damaging for mental health and well-being. And, in my view, far more so than retaking an exam in post-16 education. And the final thing I'd add really is that I do think that, there could be changes to the way this is delivered to make it more effective, because if you're a student with a very low prior attainment, for example, a grade 1, you probably shouldn't be being entered for an exam, within the first year of enrolling in post-16 education. You've got very big gaps in your foundational knowledge and skills, and actually the teachers need, more time with that young person to be able to address those gaps and, really give them that meaningful opportunity to develop their skills and acquire, a qualification in post-16 education. So I think there are changes that could happen so that, we certainly shouldn't be having like a cycle of students being entered in for an exam in November and then May and then November and May. That shouldn't be happening. So that is something that I'm hoping will be addressed through the department's curriculum and assessment review.
Very interesting perspective. Lee, do you have sympathy with these rather robust criticisms of the current research policy, or do you think they go a bit too far?
I think it's easy to criticise a policy. What I've found in my long years in the education world is you can, frame the most beautiful programme or policy you like, but it always comes down to the implementation, the delivery, how well it's done. It's the sort of messier side of education policy in many ways. And I think it's very hard. In the old days, when I used to present on the famous EF talk, I used to talk about the Bananarama principle. It's not what you do, it's the way you do it that counts. It's after the Bananarama song of the 1980s. I don't know if you two remember that cultural reference. But anyway, it was a bit of a sort of fun thing we did with teachers, but it's really important at policy level as well. How is it delivered? And Sarah's absolutely right. And by the way, I sat in on a Get Further session about a year ago, and the young people that were there that had the grades that had been written off, it was so emotional actually seeing these young people who had lots of talent but had been written off. So I think this policy should stay, but we need to look at how it's delivered. The other thing I would say with this, Tom, is in many ways, our research shows that a lot of the problems are, of course, earlier on in the system. So half of the forgotten fifth, those young people who don't get maths and English GCSEs at grade 4, half are judged as falling behind at age 5 by their teachers. So, it always comes back to quality of teaching in schools. And if we had better responses or there was more capacity in the system to respond to those earlier barriers and trajectories, then we wouldn't be where we are, at age 16. Saying that, that's going to take years to get better. So I think you've still got to have some sort of policy around retakes. The other thing that was interesting for me when I spoke on the media about this over the summer during the results was that I was contacted by many parents. It was really interesting. And they had views that were quite different to some of us in the education system. They were saying they didn't want their child to get a grade 3 because they didn't want them to take the GCSE. They would rather them do a functional qualification. I thought that was really interesting. So I do think there is a discussion around, is it right? Is the qualification right? For someone like me who did a PhD in theoretical physics, of course, you love your quadratic equations. There's a little bit of me, and I'd be interested in what Sarah thinks of this, because I suppose I'm being pragmatic, thinking we've got these qualifications. A grade 4 seems to be, a fair judgment of what functional skills are. But people do challenge me on that and say, Lee, actually, we need better functional skills for some young people. The problem with that, I think, is that at the moment, these grade 4s are the things that matter in the world, right? So, if you don't have these qualifications, employers might not look at you. You can't get into sixth forms or colleges. So I guess I'm being pragmatic in just assuming that is what we work with. And it'll be interesting to see what the curriculum review does. Does it challenge some of these things? It'll be interesting to see that. But if we're assuming that the GCSEs stay as they are, I think there are some parents, really interestingly, that were arguing that they'd rather their children do a more functional type route. So that was really interesting to me. One thought I did have was maybe there could be a bit of a discussion with teachers in the schools about what the appropriate route might be for young people. That has its dangers as well, of course. So maybe it's not automatic that you do the retake, but I would worry about that because it would vary by school, and some young people would be put forward, some people wouldn't. So there are some real nuances, I think, in this policy. So sorry, I'm rambling now, but those were some thoughts.
Not at all. Some very interesting thoughts. So you mentioned this point around functional skills, because as Sarah said at the beginning, if you get a grade 2 or below at GCSE, then there are other qualifications that you are allowed to then sit post-16 instead of a GCSE. And one of the issues that I've seen raised by a lot of people who don't like the current resits policy is that they say that GCSEs, they're very academic qualifications. They're delivered in an academic environment. They are often sat alongside academic subjects, of course, pre-16. And so when the current GCSE English and Maths qualifications were designed about a decade or so ago, I did see a lot of concern from stakeholders. They didn't really think they focused enough on basic literacy and numeracy skills, whereas these alternative qualifications, at least in theory, focus a lot more on those functional, those applied skills. So if the goal is to improve literacy and numeracy, would it make sense to offer more alternatives to students, either post-16 or perhaps more controversially pre-16 alongside or maybe even instead of GCSEs, rather than waiting for students to fail a GCSE and then give them more choice after that? Sarah, what's your take on this? Lee thinks there is a case to maybe look at this area in terms of possible alternative qualifications and routes and pathways. Should we be offering students more choice and more routes rather than the way the current policy operates?
So functional skills qualifications are available within the current policy. But I think I share, some of the concerns that Lee was alluding to really about. We also have to be really careful about, not creating a two-tier system as well. And in particular, being really careful that we don't go down the road of kind of categorizing young people's brains into whether they're academic or kind of applied or vocational, because we know what happens if we go down that road. It is often the young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who get labelled as being not academic enough when it's nothing to do with their raw potential or cognitive ability, but actually the additional barriers that they face in life that prevent them from attaining the same outcomes as their peers. And just to go back to something that Lee said, actually, in terms of where the focus should be in the system as well, there's actually quite a lot of new evidence within neuroscience that late adolescence is a particular window of opportunity for learning. So while we also need to, be working to improve outcomes pre-16, we really need to be harnessing, this moment in late adolescence, given what science is telling us about the potential of these young people to actually particularly develop key cognitive skills, linked to literacy and numeracy within this window. And as I mentioned before, there is no reason why we can't increase the overall proportion of young people holding a level 2 in English and Maths to 85-90% by the age of 19 over the next 10 years, provided that the sector is funded and resourced and supported to be able to do this. Because as Lee said, it's, a lot of it's in that, actual delivery of the policy. And for the vast majority of these young people, that standard could be a GCSE at grade 4 or above. But you will notice that, I'm not saying 100% of young people, and that is because I do believe that there will be a small minority of young people who have specific additional needs for whom reaching that standard could be a stretch. So for this group, I would like to see, more of a focus in terms of that delivery on the very foundational basics. In theory, this could already happen within the current system, but for various different reasons, it isn't. So, I am, thinking whether a new stepping stone qualification that contains half the content of the GCSE could incentivize settings to deliver and teach in this way. Particularly for thinking about those learners with the very lowest prior attainment. But I do also want to be clear that, I don't think this is about creating a new functional or applied qualification, because I think we can get caught up in a bit of a myth that this is the solution to this very challenging and knotty problem. In my experience, adding in an additional layer of functionality often makes it harder for these young people to then understand and interpret the questions they're being asked, because you're wrapping additional context and words and that require an additional level of understanding around the basic literacy or numeracy that you're asking them to already know. And there is a risk that if we think this is the solution, that we're actually distracting away from the very real issue and elephant in the room, which is that these students do have very low underlying basic skills in English and Maths, and we really need to address that problem first before thinking about whether it's a GCSE or a functional skills qualification that they need to be sitting.
Lee, you've talked about your potential interest in looking at English and Maths from a more functional perspective. One of the things that makes functional skills qualifications very different from a GCSE is that the functional skills is just a pass-fail qualification. So going back to your driving test point that you made a little while ago, do you think there is merit in opening up a wider discussion about whether we should be looking at literacy and numeracy and functional English and Maths skills as a pass-fail idea? Or do you think that actually your instinct says that the graded GCSE is still a better option for most people at least?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, this, because I agree so much with what Sarah's saying. And a lot of my research on equity, in the book Equity in Education, is all about the unconscious biases that teachers have. We all have. So you make judgments on young people without even knowing it. because of the accent they might have, the way they look. And there's a real danger that you could categorize certain young people for the functional route rather than an academic route. But there is also some strengths, I think, to their sort of pass-fail type model. Maybe there is a hybrid. I mean, Sarah was suggesting that there may be a sort of a different qualification that would be part of this, maybe for those that are really struggling. So yeah, I wonder whether it could be part of the system. I mean, some people have suggested this before. That GCSEs could sort of be split up in some way. That there might be a sort of more basic qualification within that qualification. I think the danger with splitting them into completely different qualifications is that you come to that sort of unconscious bias and you end up with the same young people going into the low status sort of tracks. And that, I think that would be the worry. I think all of this is, I call it the messy middle in all this. It's, people sort of in the debates go from one extreme to the other. Often I think good policy is balancing, the trade-offs really, in terms of developing these things. So I think this is quite nuanced, but I think on the whole, I would argue maybe it should be part of the qualification, but we could look at a sort of maybe a pass-fail as part of that GCSE, and then maybe it's graded beyond that. I don't know, but we'd have to think through that.
Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question for today. I don't think I've ever seen anyone suggest that the GCSE resits policy was not well-intentioned, but it has generated a lot of heated debate ever since it was implemented in 2014. The Labour government has now inherited this policy, and as you both mentioned, the Labour government have set up a curriculum and assessment review covering both primary and secondary education, and I'm pretty sure they're going to receive some feedback both for and against the GCSE resits as they stand. So, in true education policy game show style, I'm going to give you 3 options in terms of what your advice would be to the Labour government about the GCSE resits policy. Your options are, would you keep the resits as they are? Would you reform the resits policy? Or would you scrap the resits policy altogether? Sarah, what's your verdict? Keep, reform, or scrap GCSE resits?
I'm not going to do this in one word. Sorry, Tom. They should keep it, fund it properly, and improve it. So that's my view.
Okay, so they keep the policy as it is, but they put a lot more resource behind it, but you're happy with the policy as it stands?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there are changes that need to be made to the system so that we're incentivizing it to be delivered more effectively, provided that it is funded properly, because I do think that is, the fundamental issue here in terms of why we have very, low pass rates that could be a lot better. But, I'm not sitting here and pretending it's perfect. There obviously does need to be improvements.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Lee, your 3 options are keep the resits, reform them, or scrap them. What do you tell the government to do?
I would go for reform, but I really like Sarah's word improve there. I think it's great. Sarah, you'd be a brilliant advisor. You probably have been an advisor, haven't you? These are the words I would use. I think the key issue for me, and Sarah has talked about this a lot, I think the key issue, Tom, is funding FE colleges properly, recruiting really good teachers to do the English and Maths teaching, and paying them the same as other teachers are in schools. If you did that, I think this policy would be more successful, actually. And that is going to take a few years. I know the current government is talking about, isn't it, all about long-term improvement. I think this is one of those things. And I absolutely agree with Sarah that if you did that, in 10 years' time, I think we would be pushing up to those sort of 90% rates, which would be amazing.
That sounds very sensible to me. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Sarah and Lee for sharing their views on this hotly contested issue of GCSE resits. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave us a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join us when we next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.